Hi everybody, we are going to be presenting to you Chapter 22 on Type and Production, and this is Jana Pierce, and I'm here with Christopher Sweat.
Hello everybody.
And I'm going to pass it right on over to Christopher, and he'll introduce the first half of that chapter for you.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is a general overview of the chapter is type and production. So a lot of times an editor needs to be well versed in other types of print and publishing processes like graphic design and desktop publishing, even though they don't have their fingers in it all the time. So while there may be others whose job it is to make sure that those elements are fully executed, the editor should also have a basic knowledge so that details aren't missed before something goes to press or is published on the web. So a couple of definitions to start with. Type refers to the shape and the size of letters on a page, and production refers to the preparation of the documents in the form in which they will be published, whether on the web or print, etc. And a quick note, knowing the information in this lesson will help an editor better communicate with graphic designers, publishers, and printers down the road. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a font. You probably all know what a font is, but the definition is a specific set of typographic characters, and each individual letter is a character. They're designed to work together. They're sometimes referred to as typefaces, and just to give you an example, the large headline above which says working with type is a Times Roman font, and the text that you're reading right now is set in the Calibri font, and both of those generally come standard on most computers. So they're used a lot of times in the publishing industry because they're easy to access. So fonts and their uses. The majority of font families fall into two categories, serif or sans serif. And you may know that, or you may have noticed it, or you may have never noticed the difference. But a serif font features a horizontal and vertical detail, or a little line as at the end of the character stroke. You'll see the one on the left there, that's a serif font, letter A, and the one on the right is a sans serif font, which doesn't have those little lines. Sans in French means without, so with and without serif. You should probably know the difference also in display and decorative fonts, just as a note. Display fonts are bold fonts that are used for headlines and short text, and decorative fonts are script and fun fonts that you should be used sparingly in a lot of publications unless they serve a purpose, such as a wedding invitation would use a script font. An example of a display font would be a very bold Arial black font that would be used in a headline to grab your attention, but you certainly wouldn't use that in body text. So this is kind of a confusing thing, but it needs to be said. Readability and legibility are two different things. Legibility is a function of a typeface design. It's an informal measure of how easy it is to distinguish a letter from another in a particular font family. So legibility means the size of the font, the kind of the font that it is, given the person that's reading it, and how they can read that font as it goes. But readability, on the other hand, is how the typeface is used, where that means space between the letters, space between the lines, how easy does the entire body of words flow as you're reading it in the publication. It's about typography. It's a gauge of how easily the words and the phrases and blocks of copy can be read. So it's important to know the difference between the two. So here are a few basic rules if you're just starting out, specifically for a font selection. So you should probably use a type that contains both upper and lowercase letters in the body text. You know, all caps means you're yelling, of course. It flows and the reader can read it a lot easier. A serif font is the pinnacle of legibility because apparently the lines in the font, the serifs, actually guide your eye as you move through the text. As I said, all caps should be used sparingly, only in headlines or in short bursts, because it means excitement. You should know your audience when you choose a type size and a font for that matter, because, for instance, older people may not be able to read smaller text. Different people that come from different cultures may not understand, some of the fancy script text that we use. So make it more universal. Condensed type, which may be skinny, may fit a space, but it can also make things look less legible. So don't just worry about the space that you have to fill. You need to worry about what's the readability and the legibility. The last thing is to avoid mixing too many typefaces because it starts to look really cluttered. I would say, if you're just like we used in this presentation, if you use a serif font with a sans serif font and only use those two, then you're pretty good. If you're just starting out, you should probably follow the KISS rule, which is keep it simple, stupid, and basic is generally best in text selection. This is an example of font selection. So the publishing industry is pretty serious about the fonts that they use in books. They probably spend countless hours and countless meetings trying to figure out who the audience is going to be, the text spacing, the readability, how the effect is going to be. This is an example from a book called Vampires in the Lemon Grove. At the end of the book, there's actually a note that explains the specific type that they chose, which is a font called Bambo, and the reasons that they chose it. And it's so that it's got a lot of legibility and readability, and it helps your eye flow through the text. So they're actually telling you at the end of the book why they use this text. As far as type size goes, it's measured in points. There are approximately 72 points per inch, if that gives you an idea. There's a lot more information in the book about it using the rulers and the Paca rulers and point rulers to show you ideas behind that, but for the because of time, I didn't include a lot of that. Body text, such as the text that you read in books and publications, should be set from 10 to 12 points. Subheads should be 14 and 18 points. Headings should range from 24 to 72 points or larger if you're trying to make a special effect. Just so you know, the body text that you're reading right now is 18 points, which is what you should probably use if you're making a PowerPoint presentation, and you shouldn't use really anything smaller. Leading refers to the space between the lines of text, and it's called that because in the days of metal type, when they used the Gutenberg presses, the space between the lines was achieved by using thin strips of lead that were hammered to a very specific thickness depending on the point size of the letters. The general rule for determining leading is to add 20% to the type size. For example, if you have a 10-point text, you should have a 12-point leading. It's not unusual to add more leading to add more space, but you shouldn't use less leading because it can make type much more difficult to read, like this line here. This text is set in 24-point type. The leading is set at 28.8 points to give it more space and to make it easier for your eye to follow. This is about letter spacing, word spacing, and kerning, which kind of all fall in the same little category. Kerning involves moving your letters closer together or farther apart so that they appear evenly spaced, which makes them easier to read also. The quality of most of today's font families is high enough so that it does it automatically, but you may come into a situation where you would have to move the space in between the text to make something fit or to make it look more readable. So these are the three words text are examples of kerning, so you can see the difference in less or more kerning. Line length has to do a lot with justification, and you probably know what that is. The first box up at the left is left justified, which means that it follows a straight line on the left margin. On the top right is right justified, and it follows a line on the right margin. The lower left is centered text. It follows a center point, and you would usually use that in invitations or in areas where you would like to set off text. The text on the bottom right is full justified or force justified or left-right justified, which means that the left and the right margins are exactly straight. But sometimes it makes the text look a little weird if you have, too few words, and it kind of forces the words into a certain space and makes it less readable. Newspapers usually use this because they're using such skinny columns, but it doesn't particularly work well in a book format. Illustrations. So editors are sometimes responsible for making sure illustrations, like line art, photos in publications or on the web are in their correct format. So while graphic designers are generally on top of making sure that these items are correct, an editor should become familiar with the terms and format so the illustrations in the errors in illustrations can be spotted quickly and they can be fixed. A halftone image is a term that's used for converting a photo, an actual photograph, over to being able to be printed. It's called that because it contains a series of dots in a very specific pattern. You can see in the photo there, a color photo has been converted into a black and white halftone for print that simulate the look of a continuous tone. Because the printers can't print continuous tones, whether it's many shades of gray or grayscale or millions of colors, you have to convert them to a halftone so that it converts it to a dot. That brings us to resolution. Speaking of dots, resolution stands for DPI, which is dots per inch. The number of dots or pixels in a single inch in a publication. The more dots, the higher quality of the picture, more resolution, more sharpness and detail. And resolution refers to an image displays more detail or how it's capable of displaying more detail. Higher dots per inch means a higher resolution. Resolution isn't really size, but it's often confused with it because higher resolution images are often bigger, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Generally, for print, 300 dots per inch is standard. Sometimes 150 is acceptable, but never lower, or your photo could come out blurry. For the web, it's generally 72 dots per inch or 96 dots per inch, but that's because you're using memory and space to hold the photo. This brings us to photographic releases from subjects, which is pretty important. Editors should be sure that any kind of subjects in any photos have been properly identified and that they have permission to appear in the print, because after it goes to press, you could be stuck with a lawsuit for someone who didn't give their permission to appear in your book or magazine. So you can search the web and find a general release, and you can convert it over to something that you would be able to use. And the next section is choosing paper, and I think Jana's going to take over from here.
All right, so we're on to the amazing world of how to choose paper, which is about as dry a subject as paper itself. And so we're going to talk about some of the things that criteria you would use for choosing different kinds of paper, such as whether it is recyclable or it is already recycled, the size, weight, finish, which refers to how glossy the picture might be, if it's a really rough piece of paper or if it's more glossy like our book is. The color of the paper and the opacity, which is illustrated in this photo about how thin the paper can be. And the reason that these types of things are important is, first of all, it affects the price, but it can also affect readability, because if you've ever tried to read a book that had paper that was too thin and you see the words coming through from the other side, it can obscure some of the words that you're trying to read on the page that you're currently on. So I wanted to give you a note that the word folios are a reference to pages that can be printed front and back. So a folio is one page that can be printed front and back. Pages are printed on these large swaths of paper, which you can see in this photo. They are printed sometimes up to 16 pages at a time, and then cut to the predetermined size following the printing. So understanding the production process for print documents. So we have two different ways that the production process can happen. And the first way is through desktop publishing and digital printing, which is becoming far more popular nowadays, because at least for small groups of production, it can be a little bit more cost-friendly. And some of you may really run into that a lot as small businesses are doing it more and more often. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that digital printing may be a more cost-friendly choice, but the full-scale commercial services we're going to get into here. But I wanted to make a note about production editing. The general definition for production editing is that it requires decisions about paper, about binding, things like that, as well as the preparation of the text and illustrations. So it's the full body of editing when you're talking about production editing. So under the full-scale commercial services, we have typesetting and page markup. And this stage is the proofing stage. So here in this photo, you see what's called a galley, which is a long sheet of text showing the chosen typeface, the type size, and the line length. And the goal of this is to basically make sure that everything is fitting in proper order, that we don't spill over onto a new page, because we don't want to have to purchase a whole another page when we're only going to be cutting out one folio from that whole sheet. So we're just checking it at this stage to make sure everything is in proper order, that we don't need to make any adjustments to the size or to the line length to make things fit properly. And this is a more cost-effective way of doing it, rather than going through the whole printing process and cutting pages in order to produce a proof. So in the imposition and plate making stage, we're actually going to be creating the first printings. And one word of note here is the word signature, which is a group of pages that can be bound together, and it's typically 8 to 16 pages. And you'll see the photo here showing several signatures, which is kind of like a smaller booklet within a book. So it's showing all of these signatures bound together to make the full book. And oftentimes, if you look at your own books around your house, you'll see that there's kind of these delineations where groups of pages are bound together to create your whole book. So using offset lithography, you can see it's kind of a complicated process in the photo here. I've given you a link, and I'm going to provide it at the bottom of this video so you can click on it. That just shows you a kind of a 5-minute crash course on how all of this works. But to sort of just go over it real easily, the way that this works is water and ink are both applied to the plate cylinder, which is made of a metal imprinting of what we're going to be printing onto the page. And the reason this works with the water is because they use basically a kind of a grease on the words, so that the ink will ink in the right places, and the water will prevent it from sticking to the wrong places, so that when it eventually comes out on the page, you'll see the words properly and clearly. So it rolls from the plate cylinder onto a rubber blanket on the offset cylinder. So it's kind of like using silly putty. If you've ever used silly putty on your Sunday morning cartoons, it pulls it off, and so it's a little bit the same way, where in this case the ink is being rolled onto the rubber cylinder, and then that is laid down onto the paper. And the impression cylinder is basically just there to create pressure, so that you're getting a nice crisp touching of the paper to the ink. So part of color printing, as Chris mentioned, is color and how the color is laid out. And excuse me one moment, let me close that for you. Got it? So you should note that for displaying on a screen, they generally use red, green, blue, or RGB. And for print, we use CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And you can see in the photo of the lion how we can roll the paper through under several, what is the word I'm looking for? It goes through several times, and each time it picks up ink in the different colors, and then at the end you see the photo of the lion looking realistic. So then we move on to binding. And in binding, there's lots of different kinds of choices, and those choices again will affect your bottom line. You'll see the saddle stitch, which is common in small booklets, where we basically put 2 staples in the middle, and it helps the book to lay open more flatly onto the table. The perfect bind, which is just used for paperback books like the one that we use in our class, would have a perfect bind. Plastic combs, plastic coils, 3-hole binders, and then the side staple, which is similar to the saddle stitch, except it's used in books that are too thick for the staples to go through, just kind of right there in the middle. So when you're working with commercial printers, there's going to be a lot of different things to take into consideration when you go to get your quote from them. They're going to want to know things like the quantity of how many things that we're going to be printing in the end, what is going to be the size of the paper, how large is this book going to be, what kind of paper we're going to be using, how many pages are included in that booklet, how many illustrations, in other words, how much ink are we going to need to use, what kinds of inks are we going to use. There's such thing as eco-friendly inks, that kind of thing. So are we going to be leaning in that direction? Or are we going to use something more traditional? Are we going to be bleeding off the edge like you'll see in magazines? Because that can cost more because they'll print on more space even though they'll be cutting the edges off. What type of binding materials are we going to use? And how quickly are we going to have to turn this around? How soon do you need the product finished? And when you're working with those commercial printers, there's responsibilities on your part too. So you're going to need to deliver the materials to the printer. And you're going to want to provide them a printout of the entire document, including what the cover should look like. And the reason for this is because you need to show them exactly what the finished product ought to look like. That way you can be sure that they've included all of the proper pages and that the pages look the way that you've intended. This also provides you with a backup in case when everything is printed out, you can kind of show proof that you have shown them what it should have looked like, and now you can make any disputes. You should upload all of the files to the locations that they will likely give you, and provide everything in a digital format. Any other media that might be required, especially if you have photos or something that maybe need to be scanned that the printer might have to do for you. And you should include a memo kind of discussing what the quote was, reiterating any deadlines that might be part of the contract, and sort of talking about what your expectations are as far as what the elements were for it. So here we have our quiz, and this is our last slide, so we'll just let you be able to put that on pause. And we appreciate your attention during chapter 22, and we want you to have a great day.
We hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.